In a world where reputations are built and broken by whispers and half-truths, one soldier's story of resilience and hidden heroism will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage. This is the tale of Maya Wilson, a woman branded a failure, whose shocking secret turned a military base upside down. "You're the worst soldier I've ever seen." That's what Corporal Blake Morrison yelled at Maya Wilson in front of the entire mess hall. Every soldier at Fort Meridian knew her story. The failure who cracked under pressure in Syria, got 3 good men killed, and somehow still had the nerve to wear the uniform. For 8 years, they treated her like an outcast, made her eat alone, gave her the worst assignments, and called her a disgrace to the military. Maya just took it all in silence, never fighting back, never explaining herself. But Maya Wilson was hiding something. Something so shocking that when one general discovered her secret, it would turn their entire world upside down. The supply room at Fort Meridian hummed with the low buzz of fluorescent lights, casting harsh shadows across rows of metal shelving. Maya Wilson moved between the towering stacks of equipment with practiced efficiency, her worn combat boots making barely a whisper against the concrete floor. At 29, she possessed the kind of unremarkable presence that allowed her to blend into any crowd, any corner, any forgotten space where broken soldiers went to disappear. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that had seen better days, and her uniform, while clean and pressed, carried the invisible weight of someone who had long since stopped caring about appearances. But there was something about the way she moved, a precision that seemed too deliberate for someone labeled as a failure. Lieutenant Ryan Torres paused in the doorway, his clipboard forgotten in his hand, as he watched Maya effortlessly maneuver a supply box that should have required 2 people to lift. The crate was clearly heavy, marked with yellow caution tape and handling instructions that specifically stated 2-person lift required. Yet Maya hoisted it onto a high shelf with the kind of fluid motion that spoke of muscle memory trained through countless repetitions. Her posture remained perfectly straight, shoulders squared. Even as she pretended to struggle under the weight, Ryan frowned, his military-trained eye catching the discrepancy between her supposed effort and her actual capability. Something about Maya Wilson didn't add up, and it had been bothering him for weeks. Wait. How is she doing that alone? Ryan muttered under his breath, stepping closer to get a better view. The moment Maya sensed his presence, her entire demeanor shifted like a switch being flipped. She immediately began to show signs of strain, her breathing becoming labored, her movement suddenly clumsy and uncertain. She wiped imaginary sweat from her brow and shot him a quick, embarrassed smile. "All that gym time finally paying off," she said, with a nervous laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. But Ryan had seen enough military operations to recognize when someone was putting on an act, and Maya's performance was just a little too perfect, a little too rehearsed. The cafeteria at noon was a battlefield of its own, filled with the clatter of metal trays and the rumble of 300 conversations happening at once. Maya sat alone at a corner table, her back to the wall, in a position that offered clear sight lines to all exits. Another detail that Ryan had begun to notice: she ate methodically, her eyes down, but her awareness of her surroundings was absolute. Every time someone approached her, her shoulders would tense almost imperceptibly before forcing themselves to relax. She had mastered the art of being invisible, but to Ryan's trained eye, her hypervigilance screamed of someone with combat experience. Blake Morrison's voice cut through the cafeteria noise like a rusty blade. "Let's see what the failure is eating today," he announced to his crew of followers, their laughter echoing off the walls as they surrounded Maya's table. Blake was the kind of soldier who had found his calling not in service to his country, but in the petty exercise of power over those he perceived as weaker. At 32, he had perfected the art of institutional bullying, always staying just within the bounds of what could be considered military culture rather than harassment. His broad shoulders and commanding voice made him a natural leader, but he had chosen to lead through intimidation rather than inspiration. Heard you couldn't even carry ammo for your squad in Syria, Blake continued, his voice carrying across the cafeteria as other soldiers turned to watch the daily spectacle. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact, but none had the courage to intervene. The unwritten rule was clear. Maya Wilson was fair game. She was the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when soldiers cracked under pressure. Must be nice getting 3 good men killed and still having a place at the table. His words were designed to cut deep, and Maya's hands trembled slightly as she continued eating. Her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, Blake accidentally knocked over her water glass, the liquid spreading across her tray and soaking into her bread. Maya quietly began cleaning up the mess, saying nothing, but Ryan noticed the way her knuckles went white as she gripped the paper towels. Later that evening, Maya found herself alone in the kitchen area, washing dishes with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. The sleeves of her utility shirt were rolled up to her elbows as she worked, revealing forearms that were more muscled than anyone might expect from someone supposedly confined to desk duty. As she reached for a dish on the high rack, her left sleeve pulled back further, revealing a glimpse of what appeared to be professional tattoo work. The ink was dark and crisp, forming what looked like the edge of a wing or feather, surrounded by smaller geometric shapes that could have been stars. The design had the unmistakable appearance of military insignia, but unlike anything in the standard catalog of unit patches or service badges, Ryan entered the kitchen area just as Maya's tattoo became toughness that suggested she understood these machines better than her desk job would indicate. When a maintenance cart, loaded with heavy engine parts, began rolling down the slight incline toward a group of soldiers working on a Humvee, Maya's reaction was instantaneous and telling. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward the runaway cart, her movements displaying a speed and coordination that seemed to defy her reputation as a broken soldier. She reached the group just as the cart was about to slam into them, pushing 2 soldiers clear with movements that were too smooth, too trained, too perfect for someone who had supposedly cracked under pressure in combat. The cart crashed harmlessly into a concrete barrier, its contents scattered, but no one was injured. The soldiers she had saved stared at her in stunned silence, their gratitude mixed with confusion about how someone had moved that fast and with such precision. Maya stood among them, her chest barely rising and falling despite the sprint, her stance unconsciously shifting into a defensive posture that spoke of muscle memory trained through years of combat situations. Blake Morrison had witnessed the entire incident from across the motor pool, and his face showed a mixture of suspicion and anger as he approached. "How did you react that fast?" he demanded, his voice carrying the edge of someone whose worldview had just been challenged. Maya's cover story came immediately, delivered with the same practiced ease as her earlier explanations. "Just lucky reflexes, I guess," she said, but her voice carried a slight tremor that suggested even she knew how weak the explanation sounded. Blake's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, looking for tells that might reveal what he was beginning to suspect. The other soldiers began to disperse, their thank yous awkward and uncertain, but Blake remained, his gaze fixed on Maya, with the intensity of a predator who had caught the scent of prey. That night, Maya found herself alone in the women's bathroom, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the white tile walls. She had come here seeking a moment of privacy, a place where she could drop the mask of incompetence that she wore like armor throughout each day. But as she stood at the sink, splashing cold water on her face, she heard voices from the hallway outside, discussing her with the casual cruelty that had become the soundtrack of her existence at Fort Meridian. Wilson got those soldiers killed because she panicked and called for extraction too early, one voice said with the confidence of someone repeating verified facts. Another voice chimed in with even more damaging details. "My cousin was in logistics, says she was found hiding while her team bled out." The words hit Maya like physical blows, each accusation a reminder of the lies she had been forced to live with for 8 long years. She gripped the edges of the sink until her knuckles went white, staring at her reflection in the mirror as tears began to stream down her face. This was the first time in months that anyone had seen her truly vulnerable, the careful mask slipping to reveal the woman beneath, someone carrying a burden of grief and guilt that had nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with survival. "They don't know," she whispered to her reflection, her voice breaking on each word. "They can't know." But even as she said it, a darker thought crept in, one that had haunted her through countless sleepless nights. But maybe they're right. Back in his quarters, Ryan Torres sat at his computer terminal, the glow of the screen illuminating his face as he attempted to piece together the puzzle that was Maya Wilson. His fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose, searching through personnel databases and service records for anything that might explain the contradictions he had observed. The file that came up was sparse and heavily redacted, showing a medical discharge for psychological trauma following an incident in Syria 8 years ago. But the details didn't add up. Someone suffering from combat-related psychological trauma typically showed signs of hypervigilance, difficulty with crowds, problems sleeping, not the kind of physical capabilities and tactical awareness that Maya displayed every day. When Ryan attempted to dig deeper into the classified sections of Maya's file, he was immediately blocked by security protocols that required authorization levels far above his clearance. The screen flashed red with warnings about unauthorized access attempts, and Ryan realized that his searches were being logged and monitored by someone with significant authority. Even more troubling was the discovery that Maya's file had been created 8 years ago, but showed recent update stamps, suggesting that someone was actively maintaining and modifying her record. The level of security surrounding a supposedly failed soldier raised questions that Ryan couldn't answer, but it confirmed his growing suspicion that Maya Wilson was not who she appeared to be. The inconsistencies in Maya's behavior became more apparent to Ryan as he began paying closer attention to her daily routines. Her reflexes were those of someone trained in close-quarters combat. Her spatial awareness suggested tactical training, and her physical capabilities far exceeded what would be expected from someone confined to administrative duties. When she thought no one was watching, Maya moved with the confidence and precision of an elite soldier. But the moment she sensed observation, she would immediately shift into the role of the broken, ineffective person everyone expected her to be. It was a performance so well-rehearsed that it had fooled an entire military base for years. But Ryan's intelligence training had taught him to look beyond surface appearances. The weight of maintaining her cover story was taking its toll on Maya, and Ryan could see the cracks beginning to show in her carefully constructed facade. She had developed a nervous habit of unconsciously rubbing the area of her arm where her tattoo was hidden, especially when stress levels rose or when she was forced to interact with Blake and his crew. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it suggested that whatever that tattoo represented carried significant emotional weight. Ryan found himself wondering what kind of military service would require such elaborate deception, and what secret Maya was protecting that was worth 8 years of humiliation and isolation. If you think she's more than just a washout, comment below with "classified" on HOA Tragedies. The warehouse on the far side of Fort Meridian was a place where supplies went to be forgotten, a maze of metal shelving and storage containers that provided perfect cover for activities that the command preferred not to know about. Blake Morrison had chosen this location carefully, knowing that the duty roster would keep most personnel away during the afternoon shift change. He had told Maya that she was needed for inventory work, a plausible excuse that would get her alone and isolated where no one would think to look for her. Blake's crew of 4 followers had positioned themselves strategically throughout the warehouse, blocking the main exits while maintaining the pretense of conducting legitimate work. Their phones were ready to record what Blake had planned as the final humiliation of Maya Wilson, something so devastating that it would break whatever remained of her spirit and give him the satisfaction of having conquered. The one person on base who had somehow maintained her dignity despite years of systematic abuse and daily torment from soldiers who believed the lies about her past. Blake's plan in the warehouse went beyond simple harassment. He intended to create a moment of such complete degradation that Maya would finally snap or break down completely, providing him with the kind of total victory that his sadistic personality craved. After months of psychological warfare, his crew began their assault methodically, throwing pieces of equipment in Maya's direction and forcing her to constantly dodge and weave while trying to complete her assigned tasks under increasingly hostile conditions. They overturned boxes of supplies that she had already organized with characteristic precision, creating messes that she would be forced to clean up while they watched and laughed at her apparent helplessness. Blake himself took the lead in the verbal assault, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls as he recited every rumor and lie that had ever been told about Maya's service record, each word designed to cut deeper than the last and finally break through whatever emotional defenses she had managed to maintain during her years of exile and disgrace. "Show us how you saved your team in Syria," Blake taunted, his voice dripping with contempt as he kicked over a carefully arranged stack of supply boxes, sending their contents scattering across the concrete floor in a deliberate act of destruction. "Oh, wait, you didn't. You left them to die while you ran and hid like the coward you are." The words were designed to find whatever vulnerability remained in Maya's emotional armor and tear it wide open to break through the calm facade she had maintained for 8 long years of enduring this kind of cruelty. Maya's hands began to shake as she knelt to clean up the scattered supplies. But the trembling wasn't from fear. It was from rage that had been building for nearly a decade. Rage at the injustice of her situation and the cruelty of people who knew nothing about the truth she was forced to hide. For just a moment, Blake caught a glimpse of something dangerous in Maya's eyes, a flash of controlled violence that made him take an involuntary step backward before his arrogance reasserted itself and pushed him to escalate the confrontation even further. The turning point came when Blake decided to escalate from verbal abuse to physical intimidation, pushing Maya hard enough to send her stumbling into a rack of metal shelving with enough force to cause real harm. The impact was meant to be humiliating but harmless, a demonstration of his power over someone he viewed as weak and broken, someone who deserved whatever treatment he chose to inflict. But as Maya struck the shelving unit, the entire structure began to tip over, its weight and momentum carrying it toward Blake with enough force to cause serious injury or even death if it struck him directly. In that split second, as physics took over and the heavy metal rack began its inevitable fall, Maya's training overrode her cover story completely. Without hesitation, she moved with unusual speed and precision, bracing herself against the rack and using her body as a lever to stop its descent, displaying strength and coordination that should have been impossible for someone of her supposed background and current physical condition. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Maya's controlled breathing as she held the metal rack in place, her muscles straining but her form remaining perfect throughout the effort that should have required multiple people to accomplish safely. Blake and his crew stared in shock, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed and trying to reconcile it with everything they thought they knew about Maya Wilson. This was not the weak, broken soldier they had been tormenting for months. This was someone with capabilities that suggested training far beyond anything available to regular infantry personnel or administrative staff. Maya realized immediately that she had exposed herself, that her instinctive reaction to save Blake's life had revealed abilities that contradicted everything about her official story, and carefully maintained cover identity that had protected her for 8 years. "Good thing I work out sometimes," she said weakly, attempting to return to her established persona. But the damage was already done, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something that didn't fit the narrative they had been fed. General Samuel Cross had not planned to visit the warehouse that afternoon, but reports of declining morale and increasing incidents of harassment had been reaching his desk with troubling frequency over the past several months. creating a pattern that demanded investigation. At 55, the general had served long enough to recognize the signs of a unit beginning to fracture from within, and he knew that small problems left unaddressed had a way of becoming catastrophic failures that could destroy careers and endanger lives. His investigation into the base's cultural issues had led him to multiple reports, mentioning the same names repeatedly, with Maya Wilson appearing as either a victim or a catalyst in nearly every incident that crossed his desk for review. When he heard the sounds of commotion coming from the warehouse, his years of command experience told him that he was about to discover the source of many of his problems, and perhaps find answers to questions that had been troubling him about the unit's dynamics. What General Cross found when he entered the warehouse was a scene that spoke volumes about the breakdown of military discipline under his command and the toxic culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Maya stood covered in hydraulic fluid and debris, her uniform stained and her dignity under assault. While Blake and his crew attempted to look like they had been conducting legitimate work rather than engaging in systematic harassment and abuse, but the general's experienced eye immediately noticed details that others might miss. Maya's posture remained perfect, despite the abuse she had endured. Her awareness of her surroundings was absolute, and the way she moved suggested training that went far beyond basic military instruction or administrative duties. As Maya reached up to steady equipment, her sleeve pulled back completely, revealing a death's head phoenix with 9 small stars arranged in a perfect circle around it. General Cross felt his blood freeze as he recognized the unofficial insignia of Operation Black Phoenix, a mission so sensitive that its very existence had been buried beneath layers of deniability. "Operation Black Phoenix," the general whispered, his voice barely audible. "But that's impossible." The atmosphere in the warehouse shifted dramatically as General Cross stepped forward, his command presence filling the space like a physical force that seemed to change the very air around them and make everyone present acutely aware of the gravity of the situation. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of 3 decades of military service and the weight of classified knowledge that few people on Earth were privileged to possess or understand. "Everyone out now." The words were delivered with such finality that Blake and his crew immediately began moving toward the exits, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of real authority, like morning mist before the sun, leaving behind only fear and uncertainty. But as they filed past the general, his steely gaze made it clear that their actions had been noted and would have consequences that would follow them long after this moment had passed into memory. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of base operations, leaving Maya and the general alone in a space that suddenly felt charged with dangerous possibilities and unspoken truths. Maya stood at attention, her training overriding 8 years of practiced subservience as she faced the one person who could unravel everything she had sacrificed to protect and destroy the carefully constructed life she had built. General Cross studied her with the intensity of someone seeing a ghost, his eyes moving from her face to the tattoo on her exposed forearm and back again, as if trying to reconcile impossible contradictions between official records and the evidence before his eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of secrets that had shaped both of their careers in ways that neither could have anticipated when they first put on the uniform and swore their oaths of service. Finally, the general spoke, his voice careful and controlled. "Operative Phoenix, how are you alive?" The use of her operational call sign hit Maya like a physical blow, stripping away the last pretense of her civilian identity and forcing her to confront truths she had buried for nearly a decade of careful deception. "Permission to speak freely, sir." Maya's response came automatically. Formal military protocol asserting itself despite the surreal nature of the situation and the years of maintaining a carefully constructed false identity that had become second nature. Her voice carried traces of the confidence and competence that had once made her one of the military's most effective operators. Qualities that had been hidden beneath years of carefully maintained weakness and deliberate incompetence designed to protect classified operations. General Cross nodded slowly, understanding that what he was about to hear would likely change his understanding of events that had shaped military policy for the better part of a decade and influenced decisions at the highest levels. "After 8 years of lies," he said quietly, his words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning, "I think we're past protocol." The admission acknowledged that both of them had been living with deceptions that had cost them more than either wanted to calculate or fully comprehend. Maya's story emerged in carefully measured sentences, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had spent years crafting a narrative that protected national security while destroying her own reputation and future prospects for advancement or recognition. Operation Black Phoenix, Syria, 2016. 9 Special Forces soldiers sent to rescue kidnapped American diplomat Richard Harrison. The details came slowly, each revelation adding another layer to a story that had been classified so far beyond normal security. Protocols that its very existence was known to fewer than a dozen people. In the entire government structure and command hierarchy, Maya described the mission with the clinical detachment of a professional soldier. But General Cross could hear the emotional cost beneath her controlled delivery. The weight of memories that had shaped every decision she had made since that night in the Syrian desert, when everything changed forever. "We got him out," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger as she recounted the successful completion of their primary objective, despite overwhelming odds and hostile forces that should have made success impossible. "Took down the terrorist cell holding him, saved the diplomat, and extracted him safely to international territory without compromising his safety or revealing American involvement. But the cost of that success had been devastating." And Maya's voice faltered as she reached the part of the story that had haunted her every day for 8 years. The moment when victory and tragedy became inextricably linked in ways that would define the rest of her life. 8 of my team didn't make it home. I was the only survivor." The simple statement carried the weight of survivor's guilt that had shaped every decision Maya had made since that night, driving her to accept a life of disgrace rather than claim credit for heroism that had cost so much in blood and sacrifice and the lives of good soldiers who deserved better. The cover-up that followed the mission had been comprehensive and brutal in its efficiency, designed to protect diplomatic relationships and maintain plausible deniability for operations that technically violated international law and treaty obligations that could have created political disasters. "Mission was too sensitive," Maya explained, her words coming faster now as years of suppressed truth finally found voice after being locked away for so long in the interests of national security. "Government couldn't admit we were there, couldn't acknowledge what we had done, couldn't risk the political fallout of admitting that American Special Forces had conducted unauthorized operations on foreign soil without proper diplomatic channels. The choice presented to Maya had been simple in its cruelty. Accept blame for a fabricated failure and maintain the security of classified operations, or face court-martial for treason and watch her teammates. Families learned that their sons had died as criminals rather than heroes who gave their lives in service to their country. "I chose disgrace to protect the families," Maya said, her voice breaking slightly as she reached the heart of her sacrifice. The decision that had defined every day of the past 8 years and cost her everything she had worked to achieve. Their sons deserved to be remembered as heroes, not criminals who died in illegal operations, unknown to either Maya or General Cross. Blake Morrison had defied direct orders and remained hidden behind storage containers where he could observe the entire conversation unfolding before him like a revelation that shattered everything he thought he knew. Each word hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that he had spent months psychologically torturing someone who had sacrificed everything to protect the honor of fallen soldiers and the security of classified operations that kept the country safe. The formation that assembled on the main parade ground of Fort Meridian the following morning was unlike anything the base had seen in recent memory. General Cross had issued orders for every available soldier to attend, from the newest recruits to the most senior non-commissioned officers, creating a sea of uniforms that stretched across the concrete expanse. The mood was tense and uncertain, with whispered conversations rippling through the ranks as soldiers speculated about the reason for such an unprecedented gathering. Many assumed it was related to the recent reports of declining morale and harassment, but none could have predicted the bombshell that General Cross was preparing to detonate in front of 300 witnesses. Maya stood at the front of the formation, her posture straight and her uniform immaculate in a way that seemed to transform her entire presence. For the first time in 8 years, she was not trying to hide or minimize herself, and the change was remarkable to those who had grown accustomed to seeing her as invisible. General Cross took his position at the podium, his expression grave as he surveyed the assembled soldiers. His opening words cut through the morning air with the precision of a blade. 8 years ago, we failed one of our own. The statement sent a ripple of confusion through the ranks as soldiers tried to understand what failure from 8 years ago could possibly be relevant to their current situation. Today, I'm here to correct a grave injustice that has been allowed to fester in our ranks, General Cross continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the formation. Sergeant Maya Wilson stands before you today, not as the failure you've been told she is, but as one of the most decorated soldiers ever to serve under my command. The words hit the assembled soldiers like a physical force, creating a wave of shocked silence that was almost tangible. Heads turned toward Maya, and for the first time, soldiers who had spent years ignoring or mocking her began to see her with new eyes, looking for signs of the hero that General Cross was describing. The recitation of Maya's actual service record was devastating in its impact, each medal and commendation adding another layer to a story that contradicted everything the base had believed about her. Medal of Honor, classified, General Cross announced, his voice carrying a note of pride that made it clear he considered Maya's achievements to be among the finest examples of military service he had ever witnessed. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in combat operations. Purple Heart for wounds received in action. Combat Action Badge for direct participation in ground combat. The list continued, painting a picture of a soldier whose courage and competence stood in stark contrast to the narrative of failure that had defined her reputation for nearly a decade. Sergeant Wilson saved the life of American diplomat Richard Harrison, General Cross continued, providing just enough detail to convey the significance of Maya's actions without compromising operational security. She completed her mission despite overwhelming odds, bringing home an American citizen while operating under conditions that would have broken lesser soldiers. The general's words were carefully chosen to honor Maya's sacrifice while maintaining the security protocols that had shaped her cover story. But their impact on the assembled soldiers was unmistakable. The woman they had dismissed as worthless was being revealed as someone whose actions had protected American lives and national interests at the highest level. The moment that Blake Morrison had been dreading arrived with the inexorable force of justice, delayed but not denied. Private Morrison, front and center, General Cross commanded, his voice carrying across the formation with unmistakable authority. Blake's walk to the front of the formation became a march of shame. 300 pairs of eyes tracking his movement as he crossed the concrete expanse toward his reckoning. The soldiers around him stepped aside to create a clear path, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disgust as they began to understand the role that Blake had played in the injustice that was being corrected. General Cross did not spare Blake's feelings as he recited the catalog of harassment and abuse that had been documented over the previous months. Every cruel word, every act of intimidation, every moment of psychological torture was laid bare before the assembled soldiers, creating a picture of systematic cruelty that made many in the formation visibly uncomfortable. Private Morrison has spent months harassing and degrading a decorated war hero, General Cross announced, his voice heavy with disgust. His actions represent a failure of character that has no place in the United States military. The public reading of Blake's crimes served not only as punishment, but as education, making it clear to every soldier present that such behavior would not be tolerated under any circumstances. The punishment that followed was swift and comprehensive, designed to ensure that Blake's military career would end in disgrace, proportional to the injustice he had perpetrated. Immediate reduction in rank to the lowest enlisted grade, General Cross announced, stripping Blake of the authority he had used to torment Maya. 30 days confinement to quarters, followed by administrative separation from the military. The terms of Blake's punishment meant that his military service would end with a discharge that would follow him for the rest of his civilian life, making it difficult to find employment and ensuring that his actions would have lasting consequences. But the most devastating moment came when General Cross required Blake to offer a public apology to Maya, while the entire base watched. Blake's voice cracked as he attempted to find words adequate to express remorse for actions that seemed increasingly monstrous as their true context became clear. "I'm sorry, Sergeant Wilson," he managed, his voice barely audible as shame overwhelmed his ability to speak. "I was wrong about everything." The apology felt inadequate even to Blake himself, a pathetic attempt to balance scales that had been weighted with 8 years of unjust suffering. Maya's response demonstrated the grace and character that had sustained her through nearly a decade of undeserved abuse. She stepped forward, her voice clear and strong as she addressed both Blake and the assembled formation. "I forgive you, Private Morrison," she said, her words carrying a dignity that made her tormentor's previous actions seem even more contemptible by comparison. "Hatred only creates more pain, and there's been enough pain already." Her forgiveness was not weakness, but strength, demonstrating the kind of moral courage that had enabled her to sacrifice her reputation for the greater good. The formation erupted in spontaneous applause as Maya's words sank in. 300 soldiers recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The sound of their approval washed over Maya like a cleansing wave, washing away years of isolation and contempt. For the first time in 8 years, Maya Wilson stood before her peers not as a failure to be mocked, but as a hero to be honored. The transformation was complete, and the woman who had entered the formation as an object of scorn left it as an example of everything the military aspired to represent. If you think she's stronger than anyone imagined, comment below with respect on HOA Tragedies. After 8 years of suffering and silence, what could Maya possibly do next that would surprise everyone even more? The general's office was a study in military precision, its walls lined with commendations, unit photographs, and the accumulated memorabilia of a career spent in service to country. Maya sat across from General Cross's desk, her posture relaxed for the first time in years. As the weight of maintaining her cover story had finally been lifted from her shoulders, the morning's revelation had changed everything, restoring her honor and returning her to the status she had earned through blood and sacrifice in the deserts of Syria. General Cross opened a manila folder thick with documents that represented opportunities most soldiers could only dream of, but his expression suggested uncertainty about how Maya would respond to what he was about to offer. Full reinstatement to the rank of sergeant with back pay, calculated from the date of her original promotion, General Cross began, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone making an official offer that had been carefully considered at the highest levels of command. "All decorations and commendations restored to your official record, along with the recognition that should have been yours from the beginning." The financial implications alone were staggering. 8 years of back pay at sergeant's rate would provide Maya with a substantial sum that could serve as the foundation for whatever future she chose to build. But the most significant offer was yet to come. "I'm prepared to recommend you for immediate selection to lead a new special operations team." General Cross continued, watching Maya's face carefully for her reaction. Your experience and proven capabilities make you an ideal candidate for operations that require the highest levels of skill and discretion. You could be the face of military excellence, a symbol of what our forces can accomplish when they're properly supported and recognized. Maya's response was not what General Cross had expected. Instead of the enthusiasm or gratitude that might have been anticipated from someone whose career had just been resurrected, Maya sat in contemplative silence, her eyes focused on something beyond the office walls. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a certainty that suggested she had been considering this moment for longer than anyone realized. "Thank you, sir," she said slowly, each word measured and deliberate. But no, the simple rejection hung in the air between them, creating a silence that General Cross struggled to process. "I've spent 8 years helping no one," Maya explained, her voice gaining strength as she articulated thoughts that had been forming during her years of enforced isolation. "That changes now." Her words carried a conviction that spoke of purposes beyond personal advancement or professional recognition, goals that transcended the traditional metrics of military success. Maya had discovered during her time in the shadows that there were forms of service more meaningful than those that came with ribbons and promotions, ways of making a difference that didn't require the formal recognition of official channels. "There are other veterans like me," Maya continued, her passion for this new mission becoming evident as she spoke. "People carrying secrets, carrying shame they don't deserve, struggling with trauma that they can't discuss because of classification requirements." Her years of isolation had given her unique insight into the hidden costs of military service, the psychological casualties that resulted from operations too sensitive to acknowledge and sacrifices too classified to honor. The military had sophisticated systems for treating conventional combat trauma, but soldiers dealing with classified operations were often left to suffer in silence, unable to seek help without risking security breaches. Maya's vision for her future was both simple and revolutionary. "Military taught me to fight," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned hard lessons about the nature of strength and service. "Life taught me to heal." Her plan was to establish counseling programs specifically designed for military personnel dealing with classified trauma, creating safe spaces where soldiers could process their experiences without compromising operational security. "Some wounds can only be healed by people who have the same scars," she observed, recognizing that her own experience with hidden trauma made her uniquely qualified to help others facing similar challenges. The deeper truth that Maya had discovered during her years of disgrace was that glory and recognition were poor substitutes for meaningful purpose. "I don't need glory," she said with quiet certainty. "I need purpose, and my purpose is healing, not more fighting." In her words carried the conviction of someone who had tested herself in the crucible of combat and found that her true calling lay not in taking life, but in restoring it. The skills that had made her an exceptional soldier, discipline, resilience, the ability to function under extreme stress, would serve her equally well in the role of healer and counselor. General Cross found himself moved by Maya's unexpected choice, recognizing in her decision the kind of moral courage that was rarer and more valuable than physical bravery. "You're still serving," he said slowly, understanding dawning in his voice, "just in a different way." Maya's rejection of traditional military advancement in favor of service to forgotten veterans represented a form of leadership that transcended rank and recognition, the kind of example that could inspire others to find meaning beyond personal achievement. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door, and Lieutenant Ryan Torres entered with the nervous energy of someone who had been wrestling with his conscience. "Sir, I want to help," he said, his words directed at both the general and Maya. Ryan's investigation into Maya's background had opened his eyes to systematic problems within military culture, issues that went far beyond individual incidents of harassment to encompass broader failures of institutional support for vulnerable soldiers. His commitment was immediate and wholehearted. "I want to document everything. Ensure no more Maya Wilsons get buried by the system." Ryan's proposed military transparency initiative would work alongside Maya's counseling programs to create a comprehensive approach to supporting soldiers who had been marginalized by classification requirements and institutional failures. The partnership between Truth Teller and Truth Protector promised to address both the symptoms and causes of the problems that had allowed Maya's situation to persist for 8 years. Together, they would work to ensure that future soldiers wouldn't have to choose between their honor and their duty, between recognition and security, between healing and silence. If you think Maya made the right choice, comment below with "Healer" on HOA Tragedies. What kind of impact can one woman make when she chooses healing over revenge? What would you choose, glory or healing? 1 year later, the Phoenix Center stood as a testament to the power of purpose over recognition. A modest building on the outskirts of Colorado Springs that had become a beacon of hope for veterans carrying invisible wounds, Maya had chosen the name deliberately, honoring both the operation that had defined her life and the concept of rebirth that the center represented for its clients. The facility was unremarkable from the outside, a converted office building with simple signage that gave no hint of the transformative work taking place within its walls. But for the men and women who found their way to Maya's program, it represented the difference between despair and healing, between isolation and community, between carrying their burdens alone and finding others who understood their pain. The success rate of Maya's program was unprecedented in the field of military mental health, with 85% of participants reporting significant improvement in their ability to cope with classified trauma and reintegrate into civilian life. Maya's method was revolutionary in its simplicity. She didn't need to know the details of what her clients had experienced, only how those experiences had affected them. "I don't need details," she would tell new arrivals, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked the same dark paths they were navigating. "I just need truth about how you feel." This approach allowed veterans to process their trauma without compromising operational security, creating a space where healing could occur without requiring security clearances or background investigations. The testimonials from Maya's clients spoke to the profound impact of finding someone who truly understood their unique struggles. "She's the only person who understands," wrote a former CIA operative whose 15-year career in deep-cover operations had left him unable to form lasting relationships or maintain a stable civilian identity. Another client, a Navy SEAL whose classified missions in Southeast Asia had resulted in invisible psychological scars, described Maya's program as the first place I've ever felt safe enough to be honest about what I'm carrying. The common thread in all their stories was the relief of finally finding someone who could provide support without judgment, guidance without questions, and healing without compromising the secrets they were sworn to protect. Maya's work at the Phoenix Center had not gone unnoticed by military leadership, and her innovative approach to classified trauma treatment was being studied and replicated across all branches of the armed forces. Congressional hearings on military mental health had featured testimony about Maya's program, leading to policy changes that provided new protections for veterans dealing with classified operations trauma. The ripple effects of her work extended far beyond individual healing to encompass systemic changes in how the military approached the psychological costs of covert operations and sensitive missions. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had occurred in Blake Morrison, whose journey from tormentor to healer represented the kind of redemption that Maya had always believed was possible for those willing to do the hard work of genuine change. 6 months after his discharge from the military, Blake had sought out Maya at the Phoenix Center, his face bearing the marks of someone who had spent sleepless nights confronting the magnitude of his past actions. The conversation between them had been difficult and emotional, with Blake struggling to find words adequate to express his remorse. While Maya listened with the patience of someone who understood that healing required facing uncomfortable truths, Blake's transformation had not been quick or easy, requiring months of therapy and self-examination as he worked to understand the insecurities and fears that had driven him to seek power through the humiliation of others. "I spent months in therapy trying to understand why I became what I became," he explained to Maya during one of their sessions, his voice carrying the humility of someone who had been forced to confront his own capacity for cruelty. "I learned that hurt people, but I also learned that healed people heal people." His insight represented the kind of breakthrough that Maya had seen in many of her clients, the moment when personal accountability transformed into a commitment to service. Blake's dedication to making amends had led him to establish his own program called Second Chances, which focused specifically on helping other former bullies and abusers find paths to redemption through service to those they had previously targeted. Working at a veterans' hospital as an orderly, Blake had found purpose in providing care and support to vulnerable people, using his understanding of psychological manipulation to recognize and interrupt patterns of abuse before they could escalate. His program had already helped dozens of individuals break cycles of harm that might otherwise have continued for generations, proving that even the most entrenched patterns of behavior could be changed through genuine commitment and hard work. The relationship between Maya and Blake had evolved from victim and tormentor to something more complex and meaningful, a partnership in healing that demonstrated the possibility of forgiveness without forgetting, accountability without condemnation. "The fact that you're here doing this work means you understand," Maya had told Blake during their most recent meeting, her words carrying both acknowledgement of his progress and recognition that redemption was an ongoing process rather than a single moment of transformation. Their collaboration had become a powerful example of how harm could be transformed into healing, how the worst impulses of human nature could be redirected towards service and compassion. The broader impact of Maya's story had extended into policy changes that protected future soldiers from the kind of institutional failures that had allowed her situation to persist for 8 years. New regulations required regular review of classified personnel files to ensure that cover stories didn't become permanent stigmas, while enhanced support systems provided resources for soldiers struggling with the psychological costs of sensitive operations. Maya's sacrifice had not only protected her fallen teammates' families and national security, but had also created a foundation for systemic changes that would prevent others from facing similar choices between honor and duty. As Maya stood in the Phoenix Center's main counseling room, watching a group session where veterans shared their struggles and supported each other's healing, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The tattoo on her arm had evolved in meaning from a symbol of loss and sacrifice to a badge of survival and service, representing not just what she had endured, but what she had chosen to become. The 9 stars that surrounded the Phoenix no longer reminded her only of fallen comrades, but also of the lives she was helping to rebuild, the future she was helping to restore, and the hope she was helping to kindle in hearts that had known only darkness. The classified emblem that had once marked Maya as someone who didn't exist had become a symbol of transformation and renewal, proof that even the most carefully constructed lies could be overcome by truth, that even the deepest wounds could be healed through service, and that even the most forgotten soldiers could find ways to continue serving their brothers and sisters in arms. We document the madness so you don't have to.